This is metalcore. And this is metalcore. So if they're both metalcore, then what happened? Alright, let's rewind to the 90s. Before metalcore was polished breakdowns and big sing-alongs, it was just hardcore, but a little bit more metal. Metal, hardcore, metalcore. Hardcore had always been aggressive, but then bands started throwing in thrashier riffs and heavier breakdowns. It was still fast, still chaotic, but it had a new level of intensity. Of the metallic kind. Bands like Integrity, Earth Crisis, Ringworm and Converge were shaping this new sound in the 90s, but it wasn't mainstream. This was hardcore music, just played by people who probably owned a Slayer album. They called it metallic hardcore. The guitars were sharper, the energy was darker, and the breakdowns hit like a brick to the face. This sound became the foundation of what metalcore would become, but by the late 90s, some bands started pushing it even further. They weren't just making hardcore heavier anymore. They were making it bigger. The riffs got sharper, the production cleaner, and the songwriting started to shift away from hardcore's raw chaos to something more structured. Instead of just throwing in metal influences, these bands were fully embracing them. They pulled from the Swedish melodic death metal scene, bands like At the Gates and In Flames, and blended it with hardcore's aggression. The breakdowns were still there, but now they were leading into huge soaring guitar melodies instead of just being beatdown sections. This was the birth of the metalcore sound most people recognize today. Bands like Overcast, Unearth, and Poison the Well took the metallic hardcore foundation and turned it into something more structured, more ambitious, and way more melodic. The chaotic, thrashy riffs of metallic hardcore became tighter and more intricate. While some bands refined metalcore into a more structured sound, Converge took the opposite route. They embraced chaos, pioneering mathcore, a style that fused hardcore's aggression with unpredictable rhythms and dissonant riffing. Meanwhile, Merauder fused metalcore's heaviness with New York hardcore's rising beatdown movement, helping shape the more brutal side of the genre. While metalcore was merging into something more accessible, there were still bands proving that there was still space for raw, unfiltered intensity. By the early 2000s, metalcore wasn't just an underground movement anymore. It was about to take over. The breakdowns got bigger. The choruses got catchier, and suddenly, metalcore was everywhere. The chaotic, unstructured nature of the 90s started giving way to a more refined sound. The riffs got tighter, the breakdowns became more structured, and the biggest change of all came from the vocals. Instead of just harsh screams, bands started combining them with clean, soaring choruses, something that would become the defining trait of 2000s metalcore. And leading the charge was a band called Killswitch Engage. Formed by members of Overcast and Aftershock, bands that had already been shaping the heavier side of hardcore, Killswitch Engage wasn't just experimenting with this sound. They knew exactly what they were doing. In 2002, they released Alive or Just Breathing, an album that set the blueprint for what modern metalcore would become. Huge melodic hooks, crushing breakdowns, and that now iconic clean, harsh vocal trade-off. Killswitch Engage had laid the groundwork, but they weren't the only ones pushing metalcore forward. Around the same time, a wave of new bands started refining the sound, taking the heavy, melodic, and structured approach of Alive or Just Breathing and making it even bigger. Bands like As I Lay Dying, Shadows Fall, and Trivium were shaping the metalcore movement in the early 2000s, producing a sound that was louder, bigger, and to be honest, cleaner. This wasn't just an underground scene anymore. It was becoming the defining sound of heavy music for the next decade. But metalcore wasn't just about soaring melodies and precise breakdowns. Some bands took the sound in a much darker, heavier direction. On Broken Wings, for example, leaned into the sludgier breakdowns and a rawer, more emotional intensity, bridging the gap between metalcore and the darker side of hardcore. And soon, it wasn't just metalcore fans paying attention. These bands were breaking into the mainstream. With festival slots at Ozfest and major label signings, metalcore was no longer just a subgenre. It was taking over heavy music. Albums like The End of Heartache, The War Within, Frail Words Collapse, and Some of Us May Never See the World became essential to this new wave of metalcore, showing that the genre could be just as polished and anthemic as it was heavy. By the mid-2000s, metalcore was everywhere, on festival lineups, on MTV, and at sold-out venues across the world. But then, something changed. Metalcore wasn't just for metalheads anymore, it was crossing over into an entirely new scene. At this point, MySpace was the biggest tool for bands trying to get noticed, and if you were a metalcore band with the right aesthetic and a catchy song, you could blow up overnight. It was the metalcore equivalent for what SoundCloud rap was in the late 2010s. Warped Tour, which had always been the home of punk and skate culture, started making space for heavier bands. Suddenly, metalcore wasn't just sharing festival lineups with Slayer, it was playing alongside bands like My Chemical Romance and The Used. And with this new scene, came a whole new sound. The breakdowns were even heavier, the production got cleaner, and suddenly, synths. This era of metalcore wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the culture, the fashion, the online presence, the merch. It all became a part of the identity. By the late 2000s, metalcore wasn't just evolving, it was splitting into different sounds. MySpace became a breeding ground for entire new subgenres, and depending on what band you clicked on, you could hear something completely different. Some bands were making metalcore even heavier, pushing it straight into deathcore territory. Bring Me the Horizon and Suicide Silence were at the forefront of this, mixing death metal riffs, pig squeals, and breakdowns that felt like getting hit by a truck. But on the complete opposite end, some bands were adding synths, auto-tune, and straight-up club beats to their breakdowns. Attack Attack and Enter Shikari led the charge, fusing metalcore with electronic elements and basically inventing electronicore. It was chaotic, it was weird, and yes, it gave us crabcore. Meanwhile, bands like Alexandria and Blessthefall were defining what MySpace era metalcore actually sounded like. Huge breakdowns, massive choruses, and a fashion sense that made Hot Topic very, very rich. This era of metalcore wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about the image, the online presence, and the culture. And for a while, it felt like metalcore had completely taken over the internet. But if you wanted something that mixed breakdowns with massive sing-alongs, there was one band that absolutely dominated this era: A Day to Remember. A Day to Remember blurred the line between pop punk and metalcore, making them one of the most unique and instantly recognizable bands of this whole MySpace era. The fusion of metalcore heaviness with Warped Tour friendly hooks made them one of the biggest bands of the entire scene. For a while, it felt like metalcore had completely taken over the internet. Whether you're into deathcore breakdowns, electronicore chaos, or pop punk sing-alongs, there was something for everyone. But not everyone was happy about it. The scene had reached its peak, but with it came the backlash. To some, metalcore was starting to feel overproduced, formulaic, and I guess too seen. The same way nu metal had been everywhere in the early 2000s before crashing, metalcore was starting to get its fair share of hate. Some fans thought the genre was losing its edge, trading raw energy for studio polish. Others hated the fashion, the gimmicks, and how metalcore had become more about image than aggression. And of course, people were still mad about crabcore. As the MySpace era faded and fans grew tired of metalcore's polished, over-the-top image, a new wave of bands started emerging, one that took the genre back to its heavier, more serious roots. This is where bands like Architects, Parkway Drive, and August Burns Red stepped up. They weren't here for synchronized crab walking or auto-tuned choruses. This was about raw energy, tight musicianship, and pushing metalcore to new extremes. Oh, and a few blares along the way. This wasn't a total rejection of what came before, but it was a statement. Metalcore wasn't dead. It was just evolving. Instead of chasing trends, these bands were redefining what modern metalcore could be. It was at this point that bands really started to split the sound into different directions, each with their own take on what metalcore actually meant. Some bands took the genre into a more technical, futuristic direction. It was a gent-influenced wave where tone and complexity were just as important as the breakdowns themselves. Meanwhile, other bands wanted to take things back to the raw energy of metallic hardcore, stripping away the gloss and focusing on aggression over technicality. This side of metalcore wasn't about intricate riffs, it was about attitude and bringing back that hardcore spirit. And this is where metalcore really started to lose a clear definition. For the first time, the genre didn't have just one path, it had multiple, and each one sounded completely different. So at this point you have to ask, what even is metalcore anymore? So now we've got bands that sound nothing alike. Some are blending metalcore with arena rock, others are leaning into ambient soundscapes, and some are just straight up deathcore with a metalcore tag slapped on them. At this point, metalcore has become an umbrella term for completely different sounds. Some bands have taken metalcore into full-blown arena rock territory. Huge choruses, radio-ready production, and songs that wouldn't feel out of place next to Linkin Park or Breaking Benjamin. Bands like Bad Omens, Prevail, and Motionless and White have embraced massive hooks, electronic elements, and a polished sound that makes metalcore feel bigger than ever. Meanwhile, bands like Spiritbox and Loathe are pushing metalcore into a more experimental, ambient direction, bringing in shoegaze elements, eerie soundscapes, and unconventional song structures. And then you have bands like Knocked Loose and Contention that go in the complete opposite way, bringing metalcore back to its hardcore roots, stripping away all the polish and just making it as raw and as aggressive as possible. Especially in the UK, with bands like Killing Me Softly, Durendal, and Long Goodbye. So at this point, what even is metalcore? The genre started as an underground fusion of hardcore and metal, then became a mainstream powerhouse, then split into so many different sounds that it barely feels like one genre anymore. Some fans think the genre has lost its identity. Others think this evolution is what keeps it alive. Either way, metalcore isn't what it used to be. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. I've been James. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Thanks for watching.